So we are continuing our series on dealing with difficult people this morning, and today we're talking about how to handle toxic people where you work, toxic people in the workplace. Now, when you hear that, I imagine some of you, your minds kind of immediately go to someone, right? A name pops up, a face pops up, someone that you're currently working with, somebody that you worked with in the past, something like that. Most of us have had experience with toxic people in the workplace on some level, and if you haven't yet, you will one day, I guarantee you. So we all have to work, right? We have to earn a living because we all want to eat and live indoors, and unless you're the boss, you can't fire them. So what do? How do you handle toxic people in the workplace and keep it from affecting the rest of your lives? We're going to talk about that this morning. And as we start, let me just first say this. If you were to look at my experience or my work experience, especially my work experience in the secular marketplace, you could definitely question my credibility on this subject. I'll just be upfront and honest about that right up front. When I was in high school, I worked at a really small family-owned business. The owners were Christians. They were super involved in their local church in the community. It was a great place to work. When I went to college, it was a Christian college. I worked on campus. I also served part-time as a student pastor at a church. When I went to seminary, again, I worked on campus. I also served as a student pastor part-time at a church. And then 26 years ago, I moved from seminary to here and became the associate pastor for about 10 years before becoming the lead pastor. So basically, I've worked in a church environment or in some kind of a Christian environment for over 30 years now. So what do I know about toxic coworkers, right? More than you might think is how I would answer that, okay? Now, I realize some of you have this crazy idea of what it's like to work in a church office. In your mind, you imagine people just kind of, standing around the room, holding hands, singing Kumbaya, and speaking in King James, like, how art thou today, right? And the copy machine is not working. Let's lay hands and pray over it or something. Our printer regularly doesn't work. We don't lay hands and pray. There's usually some language that probably shouldn't happen in a church office that takes place. But anyway, the truth is, working in a church would be great if it wasn't for people, right? I mean, I'm just kidding. We really have a great staff here. It's a great place to work, especially for somebody like me who prefers to work more at Starbucks than they do actually in the office. But here's the deal. I may not know your office situation. I may not know the details of your organization, and I may not have a whole lot of secular work experience. But I do know people, okay? I do know people, and I know motives, and I know that the work environment can bring out the very best in people, but it can also bring out the very worst in people. And I know toxic people. And even if you're not in the marketplace right now, maybe you're a stay-home parent, or maybe you're retired, or maybe you're a student and you're not employed right now. Here's the thing about toxic people. Toxic people don't stay in the marketplace, do they? I mean, when they leave their jobs, they go home to our neighborhoods, right? They show up at Little League games. They drive cars on the Beltway. They shop in the same stores we shop in. They show up at PTA meetings. They serve on their homeowners association. And some of them go to church. And all that to say, I may not have a lot of experience in the secular workplace, in the secular marketplace, but I have a ton of experience with people, toxic people, inside and outside the marketplace. Now, before we jump into this morning, there's a couple things that I just want to be clear about what we're talking about here. Because just because we don't get along with someone doesn't necessarily mean that they're toxic. So here are a couple things just to keep in mind. First, you're going to have people in your life where their personalities clash with yours, okay? And that doesn't necessarily make them toxic. I mean, we all have people that we naturally get along with, and then we have those people that we just can't get along with. Our personalities just don't match up. Our personalities, they just clash. That doesn't make them toxic. So we need to understand what toxic is and what it isn't. Also, this is important too. People are allowed to have bad days. I mean, is that fair? Right? I mean, we all have bad days. Occasionally, we all have bad days. We yell. We say things that we shouldn't say or wish we hadn't said. We get into arguments. We leverage for position. From time to time, we just all have bad days. But that doesn't make you toxic. And a toxic person is somebody who does that all the time. In fact, here's the definition I want to use today for a toxic coworker. It's anyone who makes me feel worse about myself at every interaction. Okay? Someone who makes me feel worse about myself at every interaction, whether you're in a meeting or you're just bumping into them in the elevator. Whatever it is, you walk away from them in that conversation with them or interaction with them or whatever, and you just feel like you need to take a shower, right? You feel like all the energy's just been drained out of you, or you've been attacked or criticized or humiliated, or you just feel disrespected by them. This person becomes an expert at sucking the joy out of the life that you used to have when you were at work. A toxic person makes me feel worse about myself with every interaction. Now, last week we said that one of the things we need to do to avoid toxic faith and toxic religion is not to go where the toxic people are, right? The problem is, at work, unless you're the boss, it's difficult to do that. Your job is your livelihood. It puts food on your table and all of that. So you can't just say, every time I run into a toxic person, I'm just going to change jobs. I'm just going to change careers. Because the problem with that is, as soon as you leave this job because of this toxic person, the first person you're going to meet at your new job is the toxic person there, and they're probably worse than the person you just left, right? So they're everywhere. But I do believe that you and I, that we can limit the impact and their influence on our lives. And let's not be naive and think that toxic people don't affect us. Toxic people affect our lives. They get their toxins inside of us if we're not careful. It's like if you've ever had a chigger, if you've ever been hiking or in the woods or something, and you got a chigger, it gets under your skin, right? And it bothers you, and it itches, and you can see it, but you just can't get to it. What toxic people do is they create these emotional itches, and they affect you, and they affect the rest of your life. They make you more cynical. They make you more negative. And when you leave the workplace, you actually take their toxins home with you, and you spread it to the other people, and it affects the way you treat other people, sometimes the people you care about the most. And the bottom line is this: if we don't do something, toxic coworkers can make us worse people. So here's the question: how do we limit their influence on our life? I want to go after that today. And I want us to go after that today by looking at what biblical scholars call the wisdom literature in the Old Testament. The wisdom literature, there are several books in the Bible in the Old Testament that make up the wisdom literature. Today we're going to look at the book of Proverbs. The book of Proverbs, it's classic wisdom literature that just gives wisdom about everyday life and how to live everyday life. And as a matter of fact, if you've never read Proverbs, I would encourage you to read Proverbs. It's only 31 chapters. You can read a chapter a day and knock it out in a month. But Proverbs has a lot to say about how you relate to other people. It talks about things like gossip and laziness and honoring your employer and how to be a really, really faithful friend and all of that. In fact, here's how I would summarize Proverbs: how to deal with fools without becoming one. Okay, that's how I would just summarize what Solomon was going after when he wrote the book of Proverbs: how to deal with fools without actually becoming one yourself. And I'm convinced that if we're going to keep the toxic people from impacting our life in the workplace, we need wisdom, which is why we're looking at the wisdom literature. We need wisdom at work. So what does this look like? What does wisdom at work look like? Well, there are two pictures that I want us to see this morning. Two pictures of wisdom, and one is kind of a negative picture, and the other is more of a positive picture of wisdom. And the first picture of wisdom is in Proverbs 2, starting in verse 12, and basically this is describing a toxic person. And here's what Solomon says: wisdom will save you from evil people, from those whose speech is corrupt. These people turn from right ways to walk down dark and evil paths. They rejoice in doing wrong. They enjoy evil because it turns things upside down. What they do is crooked, and their ways are wrong. Now, that just defines a toxic person. Their speech is corrupt, Solomon says. They avoid what is right. They walk down wrong paths. They rejoice in doing wrong. They love when their moods or their comments or their actions turn things upside down and cause chaos. That's a toxic person. Basically, the methods of a toxic person is wrong in every way. And if you look at the next few verses in 16 through 18, it says, here's what a toxic person looks like specifically. And Solomon uses a metaphor, and he uses a metaphor of an immoral woman. Now, you might say, well, why did he use a metaphor of an immoral woman and not an immoral man? And here's why. Because Proverbs was originally written to young men. That was Solomon's original audience when he wrote it. So he describes an immoral woman as the metaphor. If he'd been writing to young women, he would have used a metaphor of an immoral man. But this metaphor for wisdom is the image of an immoral woman standing at a door. Okay, so think red light district. Okay, that's what he's going after. The image of an immoral woman standing at a door, and how wisdom keeps you from going through that door. I also left this passage in because, adultery in the marketplace, that never happens today, right? But here's what Solomon says. He says, wisdom will save you from the immoral woman, from the flattery of the adulterous woman. She has abandoned her husband and ignores the covenant she made before God. Entering her house leads to death. It is the road to hell. The man who visits her is doomed. He will never reach the paths of life. It's saying wisdom is going to keep you from playing that game. Wisdom is going to keep you from playing that toxic game. It's going to keep you from entering that house. It's going to keep you from living that way. Wisdom is going to help you experience life as God intended for it to be experienced and as God intended for it to be lived. I just love Scripture because it's just so practical. It says, here's what a toxic person looks like, and here's what they're going to try to get you to do. And if you have wisdom, you can avoid all of that. You can avoid their toxic schemes. The second passage, a little bit more of an upfield to it. It connects wisdom and happiness. And here's what Solomon says. He says, happy is the person who finds wisdom and gains understanding. For the profit of wisdom is better than silver, and her wages are better than gold. Wisdom is more precious than rubies. Nothing you desire can compare with her. She offers you life in her right hand and riches and honor in her left. She will guide you down delightful paths. All of her ways are satisfying. Wisdom is a tree of life for those who embrace her. Happy are those who hold her tightly. Ladies, did you notice the language there? That Solomon has wisdom as she and her. If you're a woman, that ought to make you feel really good that the Bible puts wisdom in the female sense. But that passage, it says that there's a connection between happiness and having wisdom. And we all want happiness, and there's a connection between those two. If you're going to win at work, if you're not going to let the toxic people invade your life and make you a worse person, you need wisdom. So let's talk about how do we get that? How do we gain wisdom? We can get wisdom from God, but how do we put wisdom into our workplace environment? Wisdom at work requires me to do a few things. Here are a few action steps, a couple kind of before we get to work and a couple after we get to work. So here's the first thing I want to give you this morning. Wisdom at work first requires me to recognize the bigger issues at work. Now, what do I mean by bigger issues? Well, last week we talked about these first two right here. We talked about the fact that I can't control other people and that I can't force other people to change. Those are bigger issues. Those are beyond us, things we can't really do anything about. When I go into the workplace, I step into my office. If I think I can control somebody or if I think I can change somebody, then I'm going to be disappointed. The bigger issue is I can't control them and I can't change them. I can only control and change myself. The third one, and I think if we can get our minds around this one, it will be really, really helpful in the workplace. But the third bigger issue is this: imperfect people sin and it causes damage. Right? Imperfect people sin and cause damage. And sin is simply this: it's disobedience to God's way. That's all it is. When I sin, I am disobeying God's way and God's standard for how to live my life. And so people who disobey God, they're going to hurt other people because sin causes damage. When I sin, I damage myself, and most of the time, I damage people around me too. Sin has caused incredibly intelligent people to do some amazingly stupid things. And because of this reality, I'm never surprised by it. I'm never surprised when people are hurtful. I'm never surprised when people are mean-spirited or selfish or political or leveraging for position. That doesn't surprise me at all because no behavior really should surprise you when you understand the depravity of sin. I mean, you take that principle and you take it into the workplace. When somebody treats you poorly, don't be surprised. Actually be saddened because sin has impacted their life in some way. And here's the deal about toxic people. Toxic people have experienced so much hurt in their life, and that's why they're toxic. I mean, they've been hurt and wounded, and sin is controlling their life in some way. So the only thing they really know how to spill out is just more hurt, more pain, more stuff, disobedience to God's way. And it's not only hurting you, it's also hurting them as well. Now, most of us here today are followers of Jesus, right? That means we've come to terms with our own sin. We've come to terms with our own sin. We've allowed God to take that away. So do you know what that means for us? It means that the expectation is that you and I, that we are to relate to people differently. That because we are followers of Jesus, because we've allowed God to take that sin out of our lives, we are to relate to people differently. That the expectation of followers of Jesus is that we're different. People should actually be surprised when followers of Jesus are not loving as opposed to when they are. But think about this. Why would we place that same expectation on people who aren't followers of Jesus? I mean, that's not a fair expectation. Now, I'm not saying that non-Christians can't be loving. I know a lot of non-Christians who are some of the most loving people you would ever meet. I'm just saying that as a follower of Jesus, we shouldn't necessarily expect that. But when you've experienced God's grace and you've experienced God's forgiveness and God has filled you with His presence and His power, there's an expectation that you and I are to be different. When you get your mind around that, this concept, it will change a lot of things. And I'm not saying that what they're doing is right or how they're behaving is right. And I'm not saying excuse any of that. I'm just saying that a heart filled with sin or a heart filled with hurt is going to leak into one's behavior. And we should not be surprised by that. And if you're a follower of Jesus, instead of looking at that toxic person or that toxic coworker with disgust, you need to look at that toxic coworker and yes, even that toxic boss with some compassion. And you need to figure out how do I display passion towards them, even when I don't want to. Now, will that compassion change them? I don't know. Maybe, but maybe not. But it'll change you, and it will limit the effects of their toxins on you. And this was a big one. I recognize that there are bigger issues at work, and once I recognize there are bigger issues at work, I've got to do the second thing, and it's this. I've got to ask God for wisdom. And what I'm suggesting here is that prior to stepping into your work environment, that before you ever even get there, that in some way you stop and you ask God for some wisdom before you walk into that situation. Proverbs 4 says, getting wisdom is the most important thing you can do. If you prize wisdom, she will exalt you. Embrace her, and she will honor you. When you've asked God for wisdom, what wisdom allows you to do, is to respond to people rather than reacting to them. Respond to people rather than reacting to them. When I react to someone, I react with what comes naturally to me. But when I respond to people, I respond with what's inside of me. And if you're a growing follower of Jesus, what is inside of you should be the fruit of the Spirit. And that should guide your response. So recognize that there are some bigger issues going on that are beyond you at work. Ask God for wisdom. That's what you do before work. Once you get to work, here's a couple of action steps to take. And here's the first one. Just avoid the toxic open doors. Avoid the toxic open doors. Now, I put open in quotes there because I'm referencing that passage from Proverbs where Solomon refers to that immoral person is standing at the door. Because my image is this. When you go to work and you have that toxic person, that toxic person stands by the door and they try to get you to walk through that door. They try to get you to walk into their toxic game. Part of being a toxic person is just knowing how to get under your skin, right? I mean, they know how to get to you and just suck you in to their schemes and their games. The way to avoid that door is simply to identify the door. I mean, many of us have never taken the time to really identify that door. Why is it that person gets me so much? Why is it that I get pulled in to that chaos with them? And you know why they get you so much? Because they just open the door. And you haven't identified it, and you walk right through it. Let me give you some examples. They open the door by attacking you because they know you'll respond back. They know you'll get defensive. Or they open the door by arguing with you, so you'll want to jump in and you'll want to debate them. And they know you love to debate them, even on little things, unimportant things. Or they open the door with gossip because they know you'll walk in because you'll want to sit and listen because you want to be in the know in what's going on in the office. And they know you will walk through that door. But Proverbs tells us, look how practical this is. Do not do as the wicked do or follow the path of evildoers. Avoid their haunts. Don't walk through the door. Turn away and go somewhere else. For evil people cannot sleep until they've done their evil deed for the day. They cannot rest until they've caused someone to stumble. So don't go through the door. Walk away from the door. And here's the key. The only way you'll know what the door is for you to ask for wisdom. For you to ask for wisdom, because when you have wisdom, then all of a sudden it's pretty obvious what that door is. So it's a lot easier to avoid the toxic person when you ask for wisdom. And then here's the last action step I want to give you. And this is a biggie. This is advanced stuff. This is difficult stuff. But here it is. You've got to learn to use words that build up. When you're in a workplace, when you're in a marketplace environment, when you're in your office or wherever that is, you've got to learn to use words that build up. There is so much in the book of Proverbs about the words that we use, the language that we use. And I'm suggesting you counter a toxic person with kindness expressed verbally. Use words that build up rather than words that tear down. Now, you might be thinking about that toxic person right now, and when you think about them, you want to say, David, you are out of your mind. You're crazy. There is no way that I could do that with this person. And you're right. You can't do that, and neither can I. Not on our power, anyway. That's why we need God's power. That's why we need God's wisdom. Because when we have God's presence, you have His power, and when you have His power, you have access to His wisdom. Look at this in this next verse. Proverbs says, the words of the wicked are like murderous ambush, but the words of the godly save lives. I mean, think about that for a minute. I mean, imagine this, that God might actually use you and your words to save somebody's life where you work. Maybe not save their life literally, but maybe save them from their own toxic self. Maybe save their job in some way or their career, or maybe save a relationship in their life. Somewhere down the road. We can't control others. We can't change others. Those are bigger issues, but we can control our actions, and we can choose our words. So, for example, where you work, if someone is engaging you and they're attacking you or whatever, and they open that door, and you just want to, you want to walk through that door, you want to attack back. Proverbs 15 says, a gentle answer turns away wrath, but harsh words stir up anger. So you respond to them in a gentle way. Proverbs 26, a great verse, says, when arguing with a fool, don't answer their foolish arguments, or you become as foolish as they are. By the way, that goes for social media and the comment sections and the articles you read online as well. Now, I'm not so naive, though, as to think that if you go into the workplace tomorrow and you use words that build up, that's going to solve all of the problems in that toxic environment that you have. But I do believe with all my heart that with God's presence in your life and His power and access to His wisdom, that you can choose words that have the potential to be life-giving in some way. And it may not happen on the first time or the 5th time or the 50th time, but after a while, I believe God will use your words to bring some level of a healing in that situation, in that environment. I know what I'm suggesting is not easy, but if you're a follower of Jesus, God's ways are not always easy. That was never the promise. He never said, give me your life and I'll just make your entire life just easy for the rest of your life. That wasn't His promise. But His ways are right. And His ways lead to life. And as a follower of Jesus, when we follow His ways, we can change our world, and we can change our culture, we can change our homes, and we can even change our work environments. So tomorrow, when you start your day, ask God for wisdom. Ask God for wisdom. Understand that there are bigger issues at play, that some of them are beyond your control. Recognize that you're not going to walk through the toxic open doors. And then use words that build up and see what God does through your presence at work over the next few weeks, over the next few months, maybe over the next few years. Let me pray for you. Heavenly Father, Lord, we all have toxic people in our lives from time to time. And God, every now and then they show up at work, and it can be incredibly difficult because we spend so much time at work. And even though we're not in the offices, a lot of us right now, and we're still working from home and remotely and all of that, those toxic people can still show up virtually. And at some point, many of us, if not most of us, will be going back to work, maybe very soon, and maybe some of us already are, at least in some limited way. And so, God, I just pray that as we do that, we would take some steps before we ever get there, just to ask for your wisdom and to just remind ourselves that sometimes there's just bigger issues going on that are beyond us that we just have to accept and we just have to deal with. But then, God, when we get there, give us the wisdom we need not to step through those doors, not to engage with that toxic person that just loves to suck us in. And God, when we have to, I pray that you would give us the strength to have the words that are going to build up as best as we possibly can. And God, I just pray you would just help us to be your followers wherever we are, especially at work. And because of that, we would be an example of what followers of yours look like and act like. And people would see that and they would want to lean in rather than lean away. They would want to find out more rather than just writing us off. In Christ's name I pray. Amen.